Today it is all about the brain. So we're going to start off with, you can actually, if you look closely, you can see that I outlined these ahead of time because I am terrible at drawing the brain. I'm a neurobiologist and I cannot free form draw a brain. I got too nervous. So I went ahead and traced it in pencil ahead of time. Okay, so we're going to first of all outline the 4 different divisions of the brain. We have the cerebrum up at the top. And then this isn't one of the divisions of the brain, of course, it's the spinal cord, but it's helpful to see how the brain and the spinal cord are actually connected to each other. And then we're going to go ahead and outline the other 3 structures of the brain. So we have the cerebrum. The cerebrum is in charge of our highest level of cognition. Next, we have the cerebellum at the posterior most aspect of the brain. Literally means tiny, tiny cerebrum, and it's best known for fine-tuning movements. Next, we have the brainstem. The brainstem has 3 different parts to it that are actually fairly well known: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The medulla is basically a bulge right sort of at the top, at the superior most aspect of the spinal cord. The brainstem, and then we also have the diencephalon. There are a number of well-known structures within the diencephalon. Although you may not have heard the word diencephalon before, you may have heard of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, the pineal gland. These are all parts of our diencephalon, along with a number of other structures as well. So the diencephalon is actually a number of different parts. So the diencephalon and the brainstem are both basically the parts of your brain that keep your body alive. They are in charge of things like body temperature regulation, hormone balance, breathing rate, heart rate, digestion, a whole bunch of things that if these parts of the brain are damaged, it's no doubt that you will probably suffer some level of organ failure, perhaps immediately, perhaps over time. But these are the parts of the brain that are most important for keeping your body alive. Whereas the cerebrum and the cerebellum can actually undergo significant damage, and your body will still, the rest of your body outside of your brain will still be in existence and still be functional because the brainstem and the diencephalon are still functional. So the term brain dead basically refers to the idea that perhaps the cerebrum is damaged to the point where higher level cognition, what we consider being human, is no longer possible, but the body is still able to be kept alive and the organs are functional because these structures are still intact. Let's go ahead and mark A and P for anterior and posterior, indicating that this is a side view or a lateral view of the brain, which is the typical way that we view the brain when we want to see certain structures. However, if we want to see certain other structures, we might actually want to do a frontal section or a coronal section of the brain so that we can more readily see things like what we're going to be seeing in this perspective here. So right away from this perspective, you can see that there are some dips and some bumps. And of course, there's one very long dip or very, very deep dip in there as well. Now, most of the dips that we see here are called sulci, sulcus for singular, and most of the bumps here are called gyri, or gyrus for singular. But this deeper divot that we're looking at here is actually called a fissure. And this particular one is called the longitudinal fissure. The most natural way to dissect a brain is actually to take a scalpel and just slice straight through the longitudinal fissure right down there, because it's already a natural dip that's present there. So you don't have to actually do much slicing. You basically slice down into the longitudinal fissure and keep slicing down through, and you'll be able to see the perspective like what we see up above, where you can see a number of different structures of the brainstem, the arbor vitae of the cerebellum, you can see the thalamus and the pituitary gland and things like that. So the lateral perspective is often helpful. But as you can see, there's some things that we see in this frontal view that we wouldn't necessarily see in that lateral view. For example, all of this gray stuff that I'm drawing actually is called gray matter, and this particular gray stuff is going to be the cerebral cortex. It's 0.5 centimeter of gray matter. It's basically the most superficial part of the cerebrum. The cerebrum takes up 83% of your brain's mass, and it kind of covers everything over. And so the cerebral cortex it basically is the most superficial part of every single bit of it. If you'll notice that frosting of the cerebral cortex actually dips right down into the sulci and perfectly lines up and covers the gyri as well. And it's basically very uniform throughout. Every so often you'll have a slight thickening when you have a little more functionality, or a slight thinning when you have a little dysfunction. But by and large, in a regular brain, you're going to see a cerebral cortex that is ½ centimeter thick, all the way through, coating the entirety of the cerebrum. And now we are drawing tracts or axons of neurons that exist in the white matter of the brain. So the most superficial part of the cerebrum is gray matter, the cerebral cortex. And then deep to that, you have white matter. And I'm drawing tracts to indicate that if you look closely in a frontal section, you actually can see these tracts. So cool. These are lines that are carrying information, basically. Think about what axons are. Axons are carrying information from one area of the gray matter to the next. So the gray matter is actually comprised primarily of cell bodies and dendrites. And then the white matter is comprised of axons that actually carry information from one area of the gray matter to another. So the gray matter is kind of the thinking part of the cerebrum, and the white matter is the communication part of the cerebrum. One of the most famous, or the most well-known tracts in your brain is actually the corpus callosum. And a huge advantage of doing a frontal slice of the brain is that you can actually see what the corpus callosum actually looks like. If you slice down, take a look at where it is. If you slice down through that longitudinal fissure and simply chop the corpus callosum, it's going to have a particular look to it. It has a distinctive look to it, but you'll never be able to see those axons actually uniting basically both sides of the cerebrum. So there's a left hemisphere of the cerebrum and there's a right hemisphere of the cerebrum. And the only place where they actually communicate with each other really is through the corpus callosum, these white matter tracts. But you can see that there's other white matter tracts that also bring information from and to other areas of the cerebral cortex. Well, we've spent some time discussing different parts of the brain, and we've gone into a little more detail about the cerebrum in particular, and now we are going to be discussing only the cerebral cortex from this point forward. So only the gray matter, that is the superficial most part of the cerebrum, kind of basically coating the entire superficial aspect of your brain. Okay, so we're going to divide this into 3 parts. First of all, we're going to define our prefrontal cortex, which is all the way anterior in your brain, basically just behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex is in charge of your highest level, most human thoughts, judgment, reason, personality, decision making. And I will also say that the prefrontal cortex has close ties to the parts of your brain that store facts and also to the parts of your brain that experience emotions. So it turns out in order to make full decisions and actually to carry forward with them, you have to have facts in your brain, and then you actually have to be able to attach an emotion to it as well, or you probably would never act on that decision. So the emotional center of the brain is the limbic system. The limbic system is basically going to be just deep, it's deep inside the medial temporal lobe. So it's basically deep inside and just posterior to the prefrontal cortex. There's your limbic system. Another way to take a look at it is in this frontal section. I kind of had to squeeze it in there. So it's going to be kind of in this area here. It's actually several different structures. The limbic system is going to be the hippocampus, the ventral tegmental area, the amygdala. So this is where a lot of your emotional processing and even memory retention occurs. All right, so going back to the prefrontal cortex, I personally think that probably the most important thing that happens in the prefrontal cortex is making decisions. So again, facts that are basically stored pretty much in the sensory areas of your brain. And then there's synaptic connections. As you can see, there's tracts of white matter that take information from those areas to the prefrontal cortex. And then also of course, the limbic system is really closely anatomically attached to the prefrontal cortex. So a lot of your decisions actually are made out of emotions. Simply there's a synaptic connection there that allows that to actually take place in that way. So I always just thought that was kind of an interesting thing to throw in there, just to give you a little more perspective anatomically on how everything is connected together and how that goes on to actually affect your cognition directly, in this case, decision making. All right, moving on from the prefrontal cortex then. As you'll see, I had already labeled a central sulcus, which divides up the other two major divisions of your cerebral cortex. In red, we have the motor cortex. And in blue, we have the sensory cortex. And we're going to go ahead and define 4 different areas of the motor cortex, and then we're going to divide up about 8 different areas of the sensory cortex as well. As we go through these different areas, though, it may help you to conceptualize. It's actually helpful that all these structures are sort of anatomically grouped together, because these are what we call functional groups. But when we talk about functional groups inside of the motor cortex, you're always talking about some kind of movement, what we call a descending signal, something that's sent down the spinal cord or out the cranial nerves and causes some kind of a movement of the body. When we look at sensory cortices, yes, there are many different types of sensation. There are many different things perceived within the sensory cortex, but they all have in common that they are receiving input from perhaps within the body, but oftentimes from outside of the body, and this is where things are perceived. So the sensory cortex is responsible for perceiving things that have come up the spinal cord or in through the cranial nerves, and therefore these are what we call ascending signals. So let's go ahead and get started on our detailed study of our functional areas. So first of all, I'm going to draw 2 lines, just small strips that are, as you've noticed, just on either side of that central sulcus. We have the primary motor cortex, responsible for gross movement of the arm and the fingers and the tongue. There's representation along this structure of the brain that allows for specific structures to be moved when that particular area of the primary motor cortex is stimulated. And then we have our primary somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for, it also has representation of all the different parts of the body and receives information from, the tips of the fingers and the tongue and the arm and the toes and the knees. It receives information about touch from different structures of the body, and yes, there are representations on both, on the primary motor cortex and on the primary somatosensory cortex. Remember, though, that the primary motor cortex is responsible for moving those parts of the body. The primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for receiving touch from them, the descending versus ascending signals. Also, what we are looking at here in this brain is only the left side of the brain. We can't actually see the other side, but I want you to understand that actually the primary motor cortex goes all the way from left to right like a headband, and the primary somatosensory cortex, same thing, all the way from left to right like a headband. But there is a difference in functionality of both sides. It's what we call contralateral. The word contralateral literally means opposite side. So the primary motor cortex will control the wiggling of the fingers on the opposite side of the body. The left primary motor cortex will cause wiggling of the fingers of the right hand, and opposite, in the right, whatever I just said, the right primary motor cortex will cause the left fingers to wiggle. So we have this opposite control. And additionally, there's opposite control of the primary somatosensory cortex, where if your finger touches something, if your right finger touches something, it is experienced in the left primary somatosensory cortex. And if your left finger touches something, that will be experienced on that representation of that finger on the right side of the primary somatosensory cortex. Contralateral. Now we're going to go ahead and draw our next motor area. So this is, again, a movement on the movement side of things, descending signals. Here we're going to draw our premotor cortex. Do not get this confused with the prefrontal cortex, please. And next, we're going to go ahead and draw the association area that is associated with the primary somatosensory cortex, which is called the somatosensory association area. One thing to note, and its pattern that you'll be seeing throughout this lecture, is that oftentimes there is a primary area which is a little smaller and has a little bit of a simpler function. And then closely opposed to it, usually anatomically right next to it, there will be an association area which will give more of an elaboration of whatever level of cognition we're discussing. So the premotor cortex is going to give us a better perspective on movement. You'll be able to store things like the sequence of movement. Rather than just flapping an arm like the primary motor cortex does, you can flap an arm with purpose. In the premotor cortex, you can actually do certain tasks. The one thing I want you to remember about the premotor cortex is that it has procedural memory, or task-based memory. You can remember how to do tasks. You can remember how to button a shirt or tie your shoes or write your name. All of these tasks are embedded within the premotor cortex, and it's pretty sophisticated if you think about it. The premotor cortex stores exactly how it is that the primary motor cortex is supposed to fire in exactly the correct sequence to allow you to perform certain tasks. Pretty cool, huh? So your association area then will give you a better perspective on what is meant to be done. And the same thing with the somatosensory association cortex, the somatosensory association area. The word that I usually use with this, if we want to just remember one thing about this area of the brain, it's going to be texture. So remember, with the primary somatosensory cortex, it's receiving touch sensations from different parts of the body. But the perspective on what that touch actually is associated with the somatosensory association cortex. So you'd be able to experience not just that something's touching your finger, but that the thing that's touching your finger is cotton, or the thing that's touching your finger is sandpaper, for example. So it's just a better perspective. The association areas are anatomically larger, and they're also more elaborative, better details. Moving on to our next movement part, we're going to be talking about the actual movement of the eyes, which is quite important. So there's a significant portion of your cerebral cortex that is devoted only to the movement of the eyes, which is the frontal eye field. And the two types of eye movement that we have are either saccades, which is where your eyes jump from one thing to the next, or smooth tracking, where your eyes are actually able to follow something that is moving. Now, only on the left side of your brain, in most people, and sometimes it's moved actually to the right side in certain very rare instances, but only on the left side of your brain you're going to have your speech centers. So the first one we're going to discuss is Broca's area, and for now I'll just say that this is involved in speech. It's the movement of the teeth, tongue, and lips, and I'll come back to this in a little bit. Let's go all the way to the back of the brain, where we're going to find our primary visual cortex. And of course, there's going to be a visual association area as well. And so the primary visual cortex will be involved in fairly basic levels of vision, being able to receive information about light from outside of the body. But of course, the visual association area will give a more elaborative, detailed ability. And the things that we're best at seeing as humans are contrasts, depth, and biological movement. Let's move on to our auditory areas. Once again, we see the same pattern. We have a primary and an association area. So we have a primary auditory cortex, which is responsible for basically hearing tones, being able to hear the loudness of sounds, for example. And then we have an auditory association area, and here you'll have a much more detailed ability to distinguish what sounds are, for example, a type of music, or whether you actually are hearing music versus, for example, someone talking to you. But that brings us to our next area of speech, which is Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is also involved in speech. Broca's area in the motor cortex is involved in speech. Wernicke's area in the sensory cortex is also involved in speech. And this is a good example of sending information about movement or receiving information about the outside world. And so with Broca's area, we're going to be involved in speech production. And in Wernicke's area, we're involved in the reception of speech, the ability to perceive somebody else's speech. So Broca's area allows you to create words using the movement of your teeth, tongue, and lips. And Wernicke's area allows you to interpret words that are said by other people. And you can see that these are significant portions of your cortical structure are actually devoted to these speech centers. But remember, again, these are only on the left side of the brain. It's possible that you could actually have these speech centers move to the right side of your brain if, for example, you had significant damage to the left side of your brain. You hear about very young children having hemispherectomies where they actually remove a portion of the brain. If they remove the left cerebrum, the left hemisphere of the cerebrum, that child will lose speech for a time, but over time, as long as they're young enough to recover this functionality, the speech centers will actually move to the right side of the brain, and the child will recover their speech. But anyway, in normal brains, it's actually going to be on the left side. Both Wernicke's area and Broca's area will only be found on the left side.